Hello everyone. My name is Danielle Gata. I am the Director of Education, Public Programs, and Visitor Services at the Morris-Jumel Mansion. Welcome to, or welcome back to, another session of our Virtual Parlor Chat series. This month, we're very lucky. We're joined by a special guest from the Lefferts House in Brooklyn to help us honor Black History Month and be a part of one of our programs in honor of Black History Month. So this month, we are going to be taking a look at slavery and freedom in Brooklyn through the Lefferts House. So we're going to take a look at sort of the Lefferts House as a case study. Now, if you are joining us for the first time or you need a refresher, here is just a little bit about the mansion. The mansion is 261 years this year, actually, but we're still celebrating our 260 years. The mansion was built in 1765. It's the oldest remaining house in Manhattan. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1966, designated an individual landmark in 1967, and an interior landmark in 1975 by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission. It is built on the ancestral land of the Lenape people and was likely built and funded using enslaved labor. It served as Washington's headquarters in the fall of 1776, with two more visits in 1789 and 1790. It housed Eliza Jamel and Aaron Burr, and also Anne Northup, who was the wife of Solomon Northup, the author of 12 Years a Slave, and so many more. And then it became a museum in 1904. And just some housekeeping. We have our temporary closure going on, which is just for a portion of our long-awaited restoration and accessibility project. It began in December, and we're still going through that. But while this is happening, we're still offering our virtual programming. So the next session will be on March 18th. And that'll be a really special one. We'll be joined by some folks from Phillips Manor Hall to talk about women's rights for Women's History Month and women's rights in New Amsterdam, so colonial era women's rights. And then we also have begun our Uncovering Uptown History walking tours. So they're offered Saturdays in February and will continue into March at 10:30 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. But on the second Saturday of each month, when we have our Family and Community Day, which you can see in the next line, we do not have a 1:30 p.m. tour. So that we can focus on Family and Community Day. But on March 14th, you can to that Family and Community Day, which is still continuing in the basement of the mansion through the restoration. That's 1 to 3 p.m. on the second Saturday of every month. And then on March 28th, I don't know why I put 2028, but forgive me because we're not planning that far ahead. 2026, it is the annual Easter egg hunt at MJM. That's going to be 12 to 3 p.m. There is not going to be a rain date because we don't have access to the house this year. And so be sure to focus on updates for that if we see that the weather's getting dicey and you want to bring the kiddos. And then also during the closure, we have two off-site programs at Trinity Uptown Chapel. So we have Still Here 1 and 2, which are chamber orchestra concerts celebrating Black History Month. That's going to be the one on February 28th. And then March 27th, celebrating Women's History Month. So there are a lot of really cool things going on despite the building not being open to the public right now. So thank you for being here with us today, and be sure to stay tuned for more info on some other things that we've got going on. And while we are closed, we do ask that you please consider a donation to the Morris-Jumel Mansion to help support us through this time. We are not making operating costs from ticket sales, etc., while we're closed to the public. And so in order to help us keep our programs free and low cost to the public and keep the mansion doors open for generations to come, we ask that you consider scanning this QR code and making a donation to help support us during this time. So now into some of the logistics of the evening, how to submit questions. So if you go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen, you'll see that there's a Q&A portion to the bottom toggle toolbar down there. And in the Q&A portion, you can type in your questions, and then at the end of Dylan's lecture, I will come back on the screen, be the voice of the audience, and ask those questions so that Dylan can let you know the answer to them. Be sure to put them in throughout the chat. If something pops into your mind, you could type it in at any point, and then we'll just be reading those at the end. So thank you for your patience in waiting for the Q&A portion, and thank you for being part of this two-way conversation with us. And now, I'm very happy to announce our speaker for this evening. I do want to highlight one small change. Riah Kinsey is no longer able to join us this evening. He is sick and is not able to make it, and so we send him lots of well wishes and hope that he can join us again some other time to share all of his wonderful knowledge with us, and we'll hope that you all join us again as well to hear from Riah. But we do have Dylan Yeats here with us today. He's a committed public historian and trained archivist who has directed, curated, and consulted on numerous community memory projects and history exhibits. Proud descendant of refugees who fled ethnic and political persecution in Europe, Yeats is earned a master's degree in public history and archival management and a doctorate in U.S. history from NYU. His scholarship focuses on the culture war, politics of race, gender, religion, and empire, from the Indian Wars of the colonial period to the Islamophobia of today, as well as the history of New York City and especially its largest borough, Brooklyn. Yeats considers democratic history making to be a form of social healing and community building, so he seeks to share hard-to-find resources and methods wherever he can. And with that, I turn the floor over to you, Dylan, and I'm excited to hear your lecture today.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And thank you, everybody, for joining us this evening. I'm just going to try to share my screen. Give me one moment. So, yes, I, as Danielle mentioned, I have a sort of academic background in archives as well as history generally, and how to communicate it in a public setting. I was obviously familiar with the history of slavery in New York as a scholar, but I was not my primary focus. But it's become my primary focus, or one of my primary focuses, as I engage in the work over here at Lefferts Historic House in Prospect Park in Brooklyn, which is a 1783 Dutch American farmhouse that was actually moved into the park in 1918 to be a museum dedicated to exploring Brooklyn's agricultural past. It's owned by the city of New York, and it's operated by the Prospect Park Alliance, which is my employer, as well as the Historic House Trust. And we're doing some really exciting things over here at Lefferts Historic House, which had been closed for quite a number of years. And as part of its reopening, the Alliance received money from the Brooklyn delegation of the City Council to do another round of research into the house that I was commissioned to do, to more fully engage with the histories of indigenous dispossession, but also African enslavement at the site, which everyone knew was part of the history, but there had not yet been any funding invested into really fleshing out that story. So this project actually sort of started as a research project, and then through the generous support of the Mellon Foundation, turned into one pilot year. And now we've reopened the museum with a new interpretation, really focusing on indigenous history of Brooklyn, as well as the legacy of slavery in Brooklyn. And we're trying to work very actively with our audiences, with our community partners. We have an advisory committee on how to sort of effectively tell and commemorate and communicate this really important chapter of New York City history and national history that a lot of people don't know about, and especially how to do that for all ages in a public park, which there aren't that many opportunities for. So it's a very exciting time here at Lefferts Historic House, and I would really encourage everybody who's interested to check us out online, it's prospectpark.org, which is run by the Prospect Park Alliance. And we have our interpretive plan, which is our dreams and goals for how we want to communicate this history in the landscape, as well as through cultural programming, and as well as through exhibits at the house going forward. So definitely check us out online. And we're a seasonal museum, at least for now. We're open May through November. So please consider coming and checking us out in person when we reopen in May. With that, what I want to do is sort of talk a little bit about how I went about the research and what we learned, and how we're trying to build that into the programming that we do here at the house. And so in a lot of ways, I think even though the house is sort of exceptional in the sense that it was preserved, whereas others weren't, and it was preserved in part because the Lefferts were a hugely influential political family, and their descendants had a lot of pull to get their house sort of preserved. One of the people who lived in this house, Gertrude Lefferts Vanderbilt, wrote one of the only histories of Flatbush. It's called The Social History of Flatbush, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, but at one time was its own town. And so for a lot of reasons, the house is unique, but also for a lot of reasons, the house is not that unique. And the majority of the people who lived here were everyday people. But what they did was extraordinary. What they had to endure was very humbling. And so we're hoping that their stories can kind of inspire visitors to learn more about the past and really see themselves in a different way. So with that, I want to just sort of dive in to how we're using the research to sort of fuel that. One of the things that's important to recognize is just how central slavery was to Brooklyn society and New York society in general. Kings County, which is encompasses all of Brooklyn today, but used to be comprised of 6 villages that combined to make Brooklyn, was actually the largest slave-owning county above the Mason-Dixon line. It was a very agricultural area, feeding New York City just across the river, and that was one of the reasons why. It was also a particularly Dutch area of lower New York, and some of the Dutch American families were some of the last to give up the institution of enslavement. And so slavery was much more prevalent in Brooklyn than it was in some other places, a little bit longer than other places as well. And it's just a humbling fact to really look at just how many generations of enslavement were present on this land. In fact, the Lefferts family arrived in 1661 and began farming initially as tenants in Flatbush with a person that was enslaved that they brought from the Netherlands. And slavery was subsequently abolished in the Netherlands, but that's another part of the story. Is it's really deep connection with the Dutch in the New World and in the Caribbean. That whole trade system was brought to New York and Brooklyn when that began. And primarily from that period in 1661 until the abolition of slavery in 1827, and even in a certain amount of sense until the 1850s, when things began to change, it was primarily Africans and their descendants that were cultivating these farms. The Lefferts family, despite a lot of mythology to the contrary, most of the Lefferts were overseeing the work of others. They were not necessarily doing the work themselves. And one of the things that we're really trying to surface and highlight and celebrate, while also commemorating the violence of the whole endeavor, is that there was an enormous amount of agricultural wisdom and technical knowledge, as well as incredibly hard work that went into cultivating agricultural plantations on this scale in this area that really fueled the economic boom and the trade system that made New York, the capital of the world that it is today. And when we think about who was actually doing that work, it was a lot of people whose names have not necessarily been preserved for the most part. So that's something that we're really trying to focus on here at Lefferts Historic House. The Lefferts family is actually the largest owner of land in Flatbush in the very late 18th century and early 19th century. At the height, the plantation that they owned was 300 acres. So that was a half a mile wide by a mile and a half long. If you're familiar with Brooklyn, it spanned from Flatbush Avenue all the way to Utica, from Empire Boulevard all the way down to Hawthorne. So it's a huge tract of land. At various times, tobacco was grown. There was an orchard. There was field for cattle. But the primary things that were grown were corn, wheat, rye, and flax. And flax, as you may know, through a very laborious process, is turned into linen. And for a period of time, flax was sort of the cotton of Flatbush, in the sense that it was a cash crop. People would grow it to make their own clothes and sheets and things of that nature. But before the advent of the Erie Canal, and before shipping costs went down, and before the big cotton booms made cotton so much cheaper, flax was a very prized commodity, and that was a real cash commodity. And so flax is really central to the Lefferts story, and we're trying to really think about who was growing that and what did that entail, and how did that really shape the lives of the people of this house as well as the society around them. So far, we've identified 25 Africans enslaved at the house from its construction in 1783 until the abolition of slavery in 1827. And we made this sort of difficult decision, despite what I mentioned, that we have this lineage of many, many generations of enslaved people owned by the Lefferts family. In this area, we decided for the visitors, we wanted to really narrow the focus into people who were actually enslaved in the house that survives. This house was built in 1783 on top of the foundations of a prior structure from probably the 1680s or 90s that was burned down by the American troops during the Battle of Brooklyn, the first and largest battle of the American Revolutionary War. As the American troops were retreating into what is now Prospect Park, out of the town of Flatbush, they decided to burn the Lefferts house at that time, so they would have a better view of the British, and they could kind of create a no man's land that would protect them from the British as they were retreating. So this house that we have that is moved into the park was not constructed until 1783. And so we actually have a sign of the 25 names so far identified that we put out to the left of the museum entrance whenever we're open, honoring the oppression that occurred here, and honoring individuals who previously their experiences had been sort of overlooked by previous versions of this museum. So I'm just going to quickly read out the names so we can just pause for that. Anna, Ben, Betty, Bram, Caesar, Cato, Dick, Dinah, Flora, Grace, Harry, Isabella, Isaac, Jack, Jenny, Mary, Mercy, Nan, Nero, Samuel, Susan, Tom, Yaft. So it's very possible that there are more names that we will identify. It's also very possible that there were individuals enslaved at the site that we will never identify. And we will try to maintain some humility about that. One of the reasons that we've decided to color code these names, which is sort of tied to some of our interpretation at the museum, is to sort of recognize different people's relationship to the house. The names of the Africans in green were people who were already enslaved by the Lefferts family when the house was built. And they were likely participated in its construction, and also, we believe, may have participated in its design, since many of them were the main people operating the house. They were the ones cooking, they were the ones cleaning, they were the ones organizing, and we believe that they may have shaped how the house was actually built, given their roles that were forced upon them by the Lefferts family. The people in yellow were actually born, we believe, in the house. The house is very large. There's a lot of space for that, and there's some archival accounts that suggest that the Africans enslaved by the Lefferts family in this period were actually living in the house. And those individuals that were born in the house, it's worth noting, were numerous. There was only one white child that we know of born free in the house, and that was John Lefferts. And so it gives you some sense of the scale that we have 9 people here born into enslavement in the house, and we had one person born into freedom in the house, and that one person inherited those 9 when his father died. And then the people in blue were people who were purchased after the house was built and forced to come here to the house and work. And so it gives you some sort of sense of the different experiences and different ways people were living in the house. And we try to use the colors to sort of keep track of that. And we reference that in our interpretive materials. I'm going to get into how we did some of this research, but before that, I want to kind of talk about some takeaways. One of the things that we like to say at the museum is enslaved Africans built Brooklyn. They plowed the fields. They built the original fences that fenced in the private property that Europeans introduced into the area. They grew the food that sustained the generations of people to come. They built the roads. They actually built the forts. They processed the materials that generated the economic activity that made Brooklyn into the place that it is today. Throughout the colonial period, about a third of the population of Brooklyn were enslaved people of African descent, and they were forced to do the hardest, but also the most essential labor. So that's something that we just really want to acknowledge when we're thinking about the history of Brooklyn and what it means and what does this house sort of symbolize. Another point that we like to point out is that over the period of significance that this house covers, so we really focused on this period from 1780 to 1830 or 40, when the architecture changed and agriculture changed in this area. In that period, more people of African descent than people of European descent lived in this house. That's not true of every structure in New York State, but it's true of a lot of structures in New York State, especially these big farmhouses. Another thing we really want to focus on is that, and this is a piece that I think historians are still wrestling with. We don't actually have all the history books that we want yet. We don't have all the accounts that we need for a variety of reasons, which I'll get into in a second. But enslaved people were constantly freeing themselves. And in doing so, they were able to hasten the abolition of slavery. It took too long. It was very frustrating for all involved. But they were really the driving force of that. And they did that by escaping. They did that by threatening violence and sometimes engaging in violent uprisings, as well as poisonings and forms of sabotage. They did it through work slowdowns, which there very little evidence remains about it, but we know that they were happening constantly. And they did it by publicly shaming the powers that be and developing alliances across religious and political groups to promote this essential change of abolishing slavery. That's not a story that we have all fleshed out as a society, but that is what happened. And that's what we need to be kind of working on. The Lefferts family, now there were many different branches of Lefferts family, and different branches had different relationships to the institution of slavery, and some manumitted the people they enslaved early, voluntarily, and some, like the ones who commissioned this house and lived here, waited to the bitter end. And not only that, but these Lefferts used the money and influence that they had to try to slow down the abolition of slavery as much as possible. Peter Lefferts, who commissioned this house, was a state senator. He was also a county leader for what became the Democratic Party. And his son, who also served in Congress, as well as the state legislature, routinely and consistently tried to stop the abolition of slavery in New York. And then when they failed at that, tried to stop Black voting rights. And so that's another important piece of this puzzle. And one of the ways that we kind of are guided in this is that we really believe that honoring the everyday heroes who endured um, so much and were able to accomplish so much despite their oppression really helps us honor each other today. And learning from the resistance and resilience of these people in the past helps us teach each other how we can thrive um, amidst the obstacles that we face today too. So that's kind of the tone that we're trying to take at Lefferts, is to really learn from these biographies. And I should just say that when we first engaged in this Reimagine Lefferts initiative to learn more, to figure out what should we do with this house, what should we, what should guide our interpretation. We held a series of community conversations and public meetings, and you can see some of that on our website. But the first and primary thing that that our audience, that our neighbors, that descendants of people enslaved in the Americas who live near us, near the museum, and are engaged with the museum, what they wanted was biographies. They wanted to know as much as we possibly could know about the people who were enslaved at the house, and let's start from there. So that's really what guided the research. And so now I'm going to move into how we did the research and how we're still doing the research, because I started it and now Riah's been helping, and we're working with other consultants as well, and we're trying to push the story before. So this is we're not finished, but we've actually been able to achieve, get a lot more information than you might think by having the ability through the support of the Prospect Park Alliance, as well as our funders, and particularly the Mellon Foundation, but also others, to dedicate the time and resources necessary to do this research, which is not easy. There's a lot more information about enslavement in a place like New York than many people would think, but that doesn't mean that it's not very time consuming and taxing to do it. One of the things I just want to mention as we go forward is that when you are engaging in this kind of work, which has got a genealogical component, but it's also very unique because of the topic and because of the period and dynamics at play, what you are almost always forced to confront is the fact that you're using records that were generated initially and then saved by enslavers to benefit themselves. So you have to really read against the grain. All the records are designed to support the institution of slavery. Otherwise, there would be no reason to make them in the first place, and there certainly wouldn't be any reason to save them. And very, very few records that were not generated for that reason. So the records that enslaved people themselves or their descendants made, or records that offer a different slice of life, were not necessarily saved because they didn't have this economic function to perpetuate this institution, and B, they were not being valued by people who had the means necessarily to be able to save these records, because a lot of the early historical societies and a lot of early libraries were founded by the enslaving families. And so they were saving stuff from a very particular reason. Brooklyn's even worse than some places because many of the records were actually stolen by the British and loyalists during the occupation, during the War for Independence, and also were neglected by city officials subsequently. So a lot of records of early Brooklyn are missing that would have helped with this, as well as some of the state census records I'll get into in a second, are also tragically missing because of the 1911 fire in Albany, where a lot of state records were destroyed. So we're working at a serious disadvantage. That said, and I think the Lefferts Historic House is particularly lucky in this way. There's a lot of luck, but I think that a lot of other areas probably have more documents than you might think if you have the time to try to find them and put them together. And there's a sort of a time component of this, but there's also a creativity component of this. So what I want to go through is sort of the records that we used to develop the profiles, and then I'm going to get into the profiles. Census records are really, really important for us for any kind of demographic or genealogical work. We're lucky that we have 3 censuses. Only one of them has the names of enslaved people, and it's amazing that Flatbush actually did list the names of uh, adult slaves in the 1755. Neighboring towns did not list the names. They just listed numbers, number of men, number of women. This does not have the names of the children, just people who are over 15 years old, but it's been an indispensable record for us. And we're really grateful that it was preserved by the New York State Archive in such a way that we can continue to use it today. The U.S. federal census, after independence was achieved, is also hugely important. But it's not until 1850 that the federal censuses give anybody's name except for the head of household, which was almost always the oldest, whitest of men in a household. It's pretty rare that you would have a female head of household or a black head of household until 1850. And 1850 is the first time where all the names of all the residents are listed. And obviously there's often spelling mistakes or erroneous dates put in, but at least it's a start. Before 1850, you really can only, you're only getting sort of top line demographic information, like either gender or race. And as the census evolves, you get more and more granular age brackets, but you're not getting any names. And so that makes it really challenging to try to understand what's happening. But it does give you a base because you can understand sort of the rough estimate of how many people you're talking about per household. As I mentioned, 1825, 1835, and 1845 New York State censuses, which probably would have had a huge amount of helpful demographic information, but also would only have the names of the heads of households, were burnt in that fire, so we do not get to benefit from them. But there are other parts of the state where those censuses do survive, and they certainly have hugely important amounts of material, which I'll get to in a second. Like I said, the records that we have, had to be generated for a reason. And that gets you into kind of the legal and political structure of a society. In 1799, or just to take a step back, throughout the Revolutionary period, New Yorkers, black and white, were promised that as soon as England was pushed out, slavery would be abolished. Interestingly, the British also promised that if they won, they were going to abolish slavery. That's not what happened. The British lost, and then New Yorkers fought about how to abolish slavery from 1783 until 1799. And they fought constantly, and they could not decide. I think anyone who's following New York politics or national politics can understand how this can happen. They could not decide how to abolish slavery. Families like the Lefferts were fighting against any kind of abolition of slavery. Others were arguing that they should be compensated. There were a lot of questions at play. So there was this deferment of this initial promise of abolition until 1799. And it was actually really spearheaded by John Jay, who was then governor of New York before he became Supreme Court justice. And Jay really pushed for this Emancipation Act, and the settlement, the compromise bill that ended up coming down the pipe was this Gradual Emancipation Act. That act perpetuated the existence of slavery, but it determined that anyone born after July 4th, 1799, to an enslaved woman, because slavery follows the maternal line, not the paternal line. So if you're born to an enslaved woman, you then are owned by whoever owns that woman. And that was a long established legal precedent in this area. But if you were born after July 4th, 1799, you were entitled to freedom for men at age 28 and for women at age 25. That law then required each town to collect birth registrations from enslaving families as to when these children were born, so that they deposited one with the town, they kept one, and that was to then verify a claim to freedom for these individuals once they came of age. As a result of that, actually, when you go into the early censuses, sometimes you'll see like whole groups of children, free children of color in a household full of adults that are enslaved, because there's different labels on the census. And that's because the legal status of these children after this act was very confusing for a lot of people. They were technically not enslaved, but the enslaving family was owned their labor and could sell it to other people until these people reached the age of 28 and 25. Now, for us, this has been a huge source of information, because some of these records, they all have to list the name, they list these birth dates, they list whoever registered them. This particular one you see on the screen here is Phoebe Lefferts, who ran this house after her husband Peter died at a young age. And so she was sort of the matriarch of this house in an early period, until her son sort of assumed that mantle. And then he started registering people instead of her. So you can kind of start to see how these dynamics play out. But that's where those yellow names came from. Then why we know that they were born here, because they were registered with the Flatbush town government, and then kept at the municipal archives, where they remain today. Now, we have about 100 of these exist for, 245 exist for Flatbush. About half of those are just transcriptions, because the originals have been destroyed through time or accident, flood, fire, I don't know. But we have transcription of a 245, but only about 100 of the actual originals remain. And if you look at these little numbers that I have, you can see these are not everybody. They're just a snapshot of what was registered. And in fact, in Brooklyn, they're completely, which was its own village at one time, they're completely missing. So they don't give us the full story, but they start to give us some sort of story. And for us, we were able to learn a lot about people by finding these, because then we can find sometimes a matching death record of someone with the same first name and a birthday, and then you can learn their last name and move it from there. So it's very painstaking, but these are hugely important. Then there's also these manumission papers. Manumission was a legal process. What a lot of people don't realize is actually before 1797, New Yorkers had to pay a 200-pound bond to free somebody. That meant they had to put this bond into the town in order to manumit someone that they enslaved, in case that person became destitute, and then the town, which at that time was required to take care of people who were destitute. So there was a financial disincentive until 1797, which is sort of part of this John Jay reform. There was a financial disincentive to free people. And this 1797 and then the 1799 Act was supposed to encourage people to free more people. And it did encourage some people to free people, but it didn't, in the end, work that quickly. But these manumission records were legal documents where the enslaver had to actually file with the town that they had freed somebody. And we have a number of these documents that are associated with Lefferts Historic House, and they can kind of confirm when someone gained their freedom. Did they, was it at the bitter end of the time period, or was it earlier? Were there conditions? Did they have children? Sometimes they mention children that they may have had when they're released, or even new places that they're living. Then family papers are another huge source of information. We're very lucky because a Lefferts descendant actually donated a lot of papers associated with this house to the Prospect Park Alliance in the early 1990s. Prospect Park Alliance, unable to care for those papers effectively, then donated those papers to what is now called the Center for Brooklyn History. So there's a Lefferts family collection there that has a huge amount of information about the Lefferts family. But I think to the credit of the Lefferts donors, they also kept and donated records such as this estate list, but also a lot of bills of sale and other receipts that document their family's enslavement of other people. And through those records, both of the Lefferts family, but also associated families like the Martens family and the Vanderbilts, we were able to piece together more names and more information about individuals by rigorously analyzing those records, which again were created to oppress, but contain within them tidbits that let us reconstruct the lives of these everyday heroes. Newspapers are also, especially now that they've been digitized and the search keeps getting better and better, a wonderful source of information, particularly because, as I mentioned before, enslaved people were constantly escaping. And you can see that in the newspapers. These are all ads taken out by Flatbush enslavers looking for people who had escaped from bondage from Flatbush in the early national period. And this is just a fraction of the number. And so when you once you have names and ages, you can actually sometimes figure out when they escaped, if they did in fact escape. And sometimes they were recaptured, but sometimes they were not. And so that's those freedom seekers are a very important part of the history. And so the newspapers are a very important part. So, when you're doing genealogical work in particular, but really any kind of historical work, the goal is to just get as many data points as you possibly can, as much information as you can, and then lay it all out and figure out how to analyze it. So you can start to see patterns, but you can also start to make connections. So what I am showing you here is one of the databases that we kind of created to chart out this, because we've been able to get hits on people across different records, and then we can begin to reconstruct their lives, because we know when they died, we know when they lived, we know kind of what they would have seen during that lifespan. We know how that relates to the construction of the house, how that relates to the Revolutionary War, how that relates to the War of 1812, how that relates to abolition, and we can kind of begin to develop these profiles. It's very, very, very uncommon. Well, we've found I think this is maybe the only quote that we have been able to find of someone who was enslaved in Brooklyn that we know for sure who talked about it. John Jay, who actually had this incredible life where he self-liberated, moved to Boston, and then moved to England, where he became a reverend and then published an autobiography in 1811, initially enslaved in Flatlands, which is a town next to Flatbush. And he left this incredible quote in his autobiography. And hearing his words, you kind of imagine, what if we had saved more of these books? What if more of the writings had survived? There are writings by formerly enslaved people in New York that exist, but they're very, very few. And this so far is the only from Kings County that we've been able to identify. And I'm just going to read it real quick. Our labor was extremely hard, being obliged to work in the summer from about 2 o'clock in the morning till about 10 or 11 o'clock at night, and in the winter from 4 in the morning until 10 at night. Later on, he says, actually, they let the horses sleep longer than the people. We dared not murmur, for if we did, we were corrected with a weapon an inch and a half thick, and that without mercy, striking us in the most tender parts. So that gives you a sense of the horrors that these people had to deal with, and we're really grateful to John Jay for being able to escape and write these words in a way that they were able to make it down to us. And we have this framed up on the wall at the museum. I'm going to just quickly profile, because I know we'll finish on time and try to leave some space for questions. Some of the individuals that we are really focusing on here. We have Flora, who was the cook when this house was built. We actually presume that she helped design the house, because she was really in charge of the kitchen, not by choice, but played a huge role. And we have archival accounts, which you have a photograph here, that talk about how she was not just the cook, but also the family doctor. And so she's a figure that we're very, very interested in. And at the same time, Harry was on the scene at the same moment. Flora had been enslaved by the Vanderbilt family next door for perhaps as many. She may have been a fourth generation enslaved person in Flatbush. Harry was also a fourth generation enslaved person in Flatbush, but with the Lefferts family the whole time. And one of the reasons we're really interested in these two for a lot of reasons, because they probably really profoundly shaped what became this house. And they brought with them this really deep understanding of the land, because they had been here for so long. both of them in the midst of the chaos of the War for Independence in Brooklyn decided to stay when many others of their neighbors used the occasion of that war to escape. They escaped to New Jersey. They escaped to Manhattan. Some of them started working for the British. Some of them were able to get out by other means. Many of them actually made it up to Nova Scotia. But Harry and Flora decided to stay. And so we've been really trying to think about, like, what did that mean for them? And we've really leaned into the idea that because they had both been in Flatbush for so long, they had such deep roots here, they had hundreds of kin that would have starved if they had not kept these farms going. And they were not able to get everybody out. So that's one of the ways that we're really thinking about this is, trying to creatively imagine what that decision was like for people that we have fragments about, but even assembling those fragments, you can kind of get a real sense. And because the 250th anniversary is coming, and also Morris-Jumel Mansion, obviously, we've been really thinking about the role of enslaved people, but also Black people generally in the war, and especially in the Battle of Brooklyn, which happened very close to our museum site. And I'm not going to get into it now because I want to leave time for questions, but there are all these different angles that people had. The British were offering freedom to anyone who left a rebel household as an enslaved person. You could get, and you work for the British Army, and you can get your freedom. The Americans ultimately did the same thing. There were enslaved people from New Jersey and Connecticut and Pennsylvania that fought at the Battle of Brooklyn and were captured here. And there were also enslaved people from here that had to negotiate what was going on around them. And at each turn, they were advocating and maximizing their advantage to try to get either concessions from their enslavers or gain their freedom from a foreign entity like an army. And so this was a huge moment in this area for changing kind of what slavery meant, but it did not end it, as I mentioned. And so this Gradual Emancipation Act remained, and the second phase of activism after the failure to abolish slavery in New York was increasing religious and political agitation by both free and enslaved Black peoples to demand the end of this terrible institution, as well as the work, slowdown, sabotage, and poisonings that I mentioned previously. That resulted ultimately in this second Gradual Emancipation Act of March 1817, which was profoundly linked to the opening of the Erie Canal and the prospect that the New York agriculture could expand so dramatically into the West, fueled by further enslavement. And that was something that Black abolitionists really were trying to prevent, because they thought it would tip the scales in the direction of slavery nationwide if New York became this really major slave-owning society. So that resulted in this Gradual Emancipation Act, March 1817, where they said, okay, now slavery will end 10 years later in 1827. And that will give the enslavers time to eke out more financial benefit from these people, but then they have to give it up. And so there's a whole nother chapter, which is interesting, of what happened after that. And so in this instance, we actually have some pretty incredible stories. Isaac, who actually successfully escaped with his wife and her children, who were enslaved in the adjacent plantation. After this act was passed, one of the things we think about is that maybe Isaac was biding his time, and when he realized that they were going to extend it another 10 years, he just had enough, and it changed his calculus. His wife also had adolescent children that could make that journey with them. So that may have also been part of his calculus. And we know about Isaac because we have records about him, but also found this reward ad in the newspaper. So there's a whole series of sources that helped us learn about that. Betty made a different choice. She was actually Flora's daughter. She had young kids, and she did not escape, but instead decided to continue working for the Lefferts family after Isaac's escape. And there's another character, Nero, who I didn't have time to talk about, but after Isaac's escape, it seems as if Betty and Nero were able to negotiate better working conditions, as well as their removal into separate houses on the Lefferts property in the wake of Isaac's escape, presumably by saying you need people to continue to work for you, you have to treat us better, or else we're going to do the same as him. We try to trace that sort of creativity and drive into the families after enslavement, and try to trace them in further into the future. They were the people who were subscribing to the newspapers, who were part of the mutual aid societies, who founded Weeksville, who founded the Black churches of Brooklyn, who ended up joining the colored troops nationally. They, many of the that's who drove the sort of creation of Black Brooklyn in this early national period, and we try to honor that legacy and learn as much about it as we can. And then I just want to close with this incredible quote. Don't know actually of Henry C. Thompson, who was president of the Brooklyn African Woolmen's Society, which was a mutual aid society as well as an abolitionist society. Don't know if he was actually enslaved in Brooklyn or not. But he has this wonderful quote in the 1830s, after slavery was successfully abolished in New York, saying that our fathers were among the first that peopled this country. Their sweat and their tears have been the means, in a measure, of raising our country to its present standing. Many of them fought and bled and died for the gaining of her liberties. So we see this quote of Thompson as essentially acknowledging this premise that enslaved Africans built Brooklyn. We haven't really, I don't think, as a city, digested what that means, but we're trying to start that conversation at Lefferts Historic House. So I'm sorry that I went a little long, but I do hope we have some time for questions. And just so you know, Morris-Jumel Mansion can share this presentation with you. If you email them, you can also email me, dyeats@prospectpark.org, if you have any questions that we don't get to tonight, or if you want to copy this presentation, or if you just want to talk about anything else. And again, please do check out our website and visit us in May. So thank you.
Alrighty, thank you, Dylan. And also just a reminder to add on, this whole entire lecture has been recorded and it will be on YouTube. So you can watch all of the parts again in case you missed the beginning, or want to go back to a bit of it as well. So now time for some questions. So one of the first questions that popped up was about clarifying how the Dutch came onto land where Native Americans lived and took possession of that land. So if you wanted to maybe share a little bit about that.
Sure. Well, they initially there were agreements to share the land with the Lenape, various different Lenape towns. But in 1643, the Dutch West India Company under Willem Kieft's leadership decided to break those agreements and take additional lands by force. And in fact, Flatbush was taken during what they call Kieft's War in 1645 and was never paid for. And there was never a land treaty or a deed for that. So some lands were negotiated under duress and some lands were actually just taken. An important point, though, is that the Dutch did not have enough people to actually keep the land, which is one of the reasons that they were inviting religious dissenters from the Puritan colonies of New England, as well as trying to get as many enslaved people here as possible in order to erect the fences and defenses necessary to maintain the land. So the story, I didn't get into this, but the stories are very, very intertwined.
You. So two people asked a question that's somewhat about a similar topic.
Sure.
And that is regarding advocacy to rename Lefferts Boulevard, or the stop on the subway line that's named after the Lefferts family, given their history as a slave owning family.
Yeah. I think there's we at our community conversations, this has come up a lot, and I hope that we can use the museum to continue to discuss these questions. There are a lot of different sides of of the story in the sense that some people consider the street names to be a form of honoring these enslavers, which makes sense, and in some ways that is true. Other people think that those street names, many of which actually different streets were named for different reasons, but some of the streets are named because that was the border of the farm, that was the border of the plantation. So some people want to keep the names because not to honor those people, but so that that past isn't lost, because it's sort of a clue when you're at Lefferts Boulevard. Oh, okay. What is that about? Oh, that was the edge of, or it actually wasn't the edge. It was a path through the farm, but still, it sort of helps you realize what was here before. And so our take, well, we don't have an official take as a museum on that, obviously, and it's up to the people of Brooklyn to decide how we want to approach that. But I think personally and professionally, the first step is to learn more about how those streets were named and what they're signifying, and use that to as a teachable moment for people to understand this. There's a lot of people in Brooklyn that are very concerned with all the development that all these histories are going to be completely erased. That doesn't mean we have to keep the names of streets, and it doesn't mean we can't add to the names of streets. So it's actually a really great question, and a big public history issue that we're all going to be facing going forward.
Thank you. You mentioned community conversations. Another question is, what is the current relationship of Brooklyn's Black community to Lefferts House and to its ties to slavery? So I know that you briefly mentioned community conversations, but if you wanted to
Yeah,
answer
well,
that
I encourage
question.
everybody to go check out our interpretive plan. We had 12 public conversations that really were trying to target descendant communities, both indigenous and African, to guide the museum. And we have a large advisory board that was primarily made up of Black culture and community leaders in our immediate neighborhood that sort of make the decisions about the interpretation and the programming going forward. So the way we have decided to proceed is really to try to turn Lefferts into a venue where African descended peoples of Brooklyn can champion the histories and the cultures that the house in some ways was built to suppress. And so we do a lot of our programming is really in that spirit. So we use the porch and the yard as a venue for music and storytelling and other forms of performance. And we host a lot of community meetings in our parlors. We design the exhibits to be very flat and easy to move, so that community groups that are aligned with the values can take advantage of the space. So we want to be as embedded and supportive of the people who are already doing the work, and the people who are carrying this history, and the people for whom this history is closest and most important. We're really trying to generate the goals of the museum to serve them first, and the idea is if it serves them, it's going to serve everybody. So we don't really have to choose, and so we're trying to be as embedded as we possibly can.
So we have time for a few more questions. So I'm going to try to get through a bunch because we do have a very lively chat today, which is lovely. So this next one is, there was a gap of about a decade between the time New York abolished slavery and when the law went into effect. Did the Lefferts or other families take the opportunity, quote unquote, to transport and sell those they had enslaved to the South to, quote unquote, monetize their investment instead of freeing them outright?
Not that we know of. And I could be wrong, but I think there was a provision in that law to try to prevent that, because that was a major issue. I'd have to check on that, but there were state attempts to try to limit sales out of the state, but there were a lot of sales within the state. And what the Lefferts did do is they sold the labor of a lot of those kids in yellow to other people. So there were some of the young women in particular, we have the contracts that they were selling the use of, Grace was going to work for you for 8 years, and then when she's of age, she's free. But that was separating these kids from their parents, even as slavery was about to end. Now, so there was a lot of that type of selling.
All right, thank you. So another question that we have is, are you doing any oral histories of the descendants of, I am assuming they mean the enslaved people of the Lefferts house.
We actually have not contacted them yet. We're trying to get our history as tight and impeccable as possible, but like many museums engaged in this work, we have essentially bumped into people on ancestry.com who are researching their ancestors, and we kind of hit, and Ancestry like kind of lets you know that if you want to know that. So our plan is to reach out to them, but right now what we're trying to do is just make sure that we have all of our ducks in a row. We were able to secure some funding to reach out to them and offer to bring them to the museum to discuss if and how they would like to be involved. Many museums that engage in this topic create descendants councils that serve as an advisory capacity, making decisions about the programming and the goals and the interpretation of the museum. That would be, if the descendants that we find would like to do that, that would be our ideal.
Alrighty, wonderful. And just so folks know, I did put Dylan's email in the webinar chat. And we've got two more questions. So was the fact that the Dutch were farmers the reason why they were pro-slavery? Any religious reasons?
I think it's primarily financial, in the sense that there was a whole agricultural system built on this, on the existence of enslavement, and in fact, a lot of the wealth that these particular families held were in people, as gross as that sounds, and as gross as that was. I think when the showdowns were in New York politically were occurring, and this also sort of happened nationally in its own way as well, there were these more kind of evangelical anti-slavery groups that were more associated with Congregationalists and Presbyterians that kind of were the most radical outside of the black churches that were mostly Methodist, but also Baptist and other things. There was a political dimension to religious activism at that time, and the Dutch Reformed churches were seen as much more theologically, but also politically conservative, and they were sort of defending slavery. So I don't know, I think it was a mix, but there were religious and economic and political dimensions to all that, and they were all kind of competing with each other, or fighting with each other. So I think that was partly at play as well.
Thank you. And then so our last question for the evening, since we are a little bit over time and I want to be able to let you go enjoy your evening, and everybody else, this is going to be the last question. What is the Lefferts family descendants' opinions of the Reclaiming Lefferts initiative? Do they support it? Are there Lefferts family descendants engaged in this research on the Africans that they enslaved?
There actually, to our knowledge, are not any descendants of these particular Lefferts anymore. But we have been visited by quite a number of sort of relatives of these Lefferts that are not direct descendants. And overwhelmingly, they are very supportive of this. We have been contacted by a much smaller number of other distant relatives of these Lefferts that are not as supportive. But we feel that, and we would be very interested to talk to anybody who has more information or wants to share their opinion about how their ancestors are being discussed. That is, I think they're right, and that is something that we want to be conscious of. But the way we think about it, and the way we've talked to the descendants that have approached us in a supportive manner, is that this is a really this is an opportunity to take a horrible history and use it for good. And so there are a lot of decisions that these particular Lefferts made that were even known at the time as being terrible, but they were able to leave us these records and this venue to engage with that, and there can be healing from that. So we really do hope to we want to make the best of that situation, and I think that will benefit all. So that's my take on that. But I really do apologize for going over. So if someone's question was not answered, please do email me, and I will respond.
Thank you, Dylan. That's very generous of you, and um, we're happy that there's just so much information that you can share with us. This has been a wonderful virtual parlor chat. And for folks who were looking for Dylan's email, that is in the chat. So you could go ahead and write that down. And then, as always, if you have questions for the mansion as well, you could reach out to us at info@morris-jumel.org. And you will find a handy dandy mansion staff member there to respond to you. But thank you all for being here tonight. Enjoy the rest of your evening, and we hope to see you back here for another virtual parlor chat. And thank you to Dylan and the Prospect Park Alliance and Lefferts House Museum for all that you've contributed to this program and this evening.
Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.